Certainly, discussing racism in America is important. Racism has been a long-standing issue in the United States, manifesting in various forms such as systemic discrimination, prejudice, and unequal treatment based on race or ethnicity. It's crucial to acknowledge its existence, understand its impacts on individuals and society, and work towards promoting equality and justice for all. What specific aspects of racism in America would you like to delve into?
Absolutely. Here are a few specific aspects of racism in America that we can explore and discuss. 1. Systemic or institutional racism. Criminal justice system. Racial disparities are seen at every stage of the criminal justice system, from arrests to sentencing. Black Americans face disproportionate rates of arrest, conviction, and harsher sentencing for similar offenses when compared to white Americans. Housing discrimination. Historical practices like redlining and contemporary issues like discriminatory lending practices can limit access to fair housing for people of color. This can have long-lasting effects on wealth accumulation and the ability to build generational equity. Education inequalities, educational funding discrepancies, unequal access to quality education, and implicit bias in the classroom continue to put students of color at a disadvantage, perpetuating the opportunity gap. Healthcare disparities. Systemic racism impacts the quality of healthcare that various racial groups receive. This can be in the form of implicit bias from healthcare providers to unequal access to treatment and preventive care, often leading to worse health outcomes for minority communities. 2. Prejudice and bias. Implicit bias. These are unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that can shape behavior and decision-making, leading to discriminatory outcomes even if an individual isn't explicitly racist. It's essential to examine these biases and their impact on everyone. Racial profiling, the practice of targeting individuals based on presumed race or ethnicity for suspicion of criminal activity, leading to discriminatory practices in law enforcement. Microaggressions. These are everyday subtle, intentional or unintentional, insults and slights that communicate negative messages to people of color. While they might seem small individually, their cumulative effect can be significant. 3. Historical legacy and its continued impact. The legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, the deep-rooted historical trauma caused by centuries of slavery, followed by Jim Crow segregation, continue to leave scars on American society. These systems created disparities and disadvantages that endure today. Intergenerational trauma. The psychological and societal trauma resulting from historical oppression can be passed down through generations, affecting mental health, economic opportunities, and overall well-being. Wealth gap. Due to historical exclusion from wealth and property ownership opportunities, a significant racial wealth gap persists in America. This contributes to ongoing inequality. Let's talk about it. I believe it's crucial to have open and honest conversations about these issues for several reasons. Awareness. Recognizing systemic and everyday manifestations of racism is the first step toward dismantling it. Understanding impacts. Gaining knowledge about the negative consequences of racism on individuals, families, and communities is essential for empathy. Solutions-focused approach. Conversations can pave the way for identifying solutions and creating policies that actively promote racial equity and justice. Which aspect would you like to discuss in more detail?
Thank you for outlining these important aspects of racism in America. Each of these areas is crucial for understanding the complex nature of racial injustice and working towards meaningful change. Let's start by discussing systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Would you like to explore specific examples or statistics that highlight the disparities faced by Black Americans in the criminal justice system?
Absolutely. Exploring specific examples and statistics is a great way to understand the stark realities of systemic racism within the American criminal justice system. Here's a breakdown of some key areas of disparity. Arrests. Racial profiling. Black Americans are far more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested by police, even when controlling for factors like crime rates. A notable example involves traffic stops. Black drivers are significantly more likely to be pulled over and searched than white drivers, although contraband is found at similar rates. Drug offenses. Despite comparable rates of drug use among different racial groups, Black Americans are far more likely to be arrested and prosecuted for drug offenses. The war on drugs had a disproportionately devastating impact on Black communities. Sentencing. Mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws take away judges' discretion and can result in much harsher sentences for crack cocaine offenses, more commonly associated with black defendants, than powder cocaine offenses, more often associated with white defendants. Sentencing guidelines. Studies indicate that black Americans often receive longer sentences for comparable crimes compared to white Americans. Incarceration. Mass incarceration. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and black Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than white Americans. This mass incarceration has a ripple effect, devastating families and communities. Specific statistics. According to a recent report by the Sentencing Project, invalid URL removed, black men are almost 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. The NAACP reports that African Americans represent nearly 1 million of the total 2.3 million incarcerated population in America. Impact. These disparities don't just affect the individuals caught in the system. The consequences of systemic racism in the criminal justice system are far-reaching. Loss of trust. Over-policing and unfair treatment erode trust between minority communities and law enforcement. Economic disadvantage. Incarceration limits employment opportunities, making it harder for ex-offenders to reintegrate and contribute to society. Family separation. Disproportionate incarceration rates disrupt families and have lasting effects on children. Note, it's important to recognize that these examples don't even cover the whole picture. Every step of the criminal justice system, from bail decisions to parole, contains points where systemic racism can have an impact. Would you like to delve into ways to address these systemic issues in the criminal justice system or discuss the long-term consequences of such disparities?
Thank you for providing such a comprehensive overview of the disparities within the criminal justice system. Addressing these systemic issues requires a multifaceted approach, including policy changes, community engagement, and cultural shifts. Here are some potential strategies to consider. 1. Reform policies. Advocate for reforms such as ending mandatory minimum sentencing, implementing alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenses, and promoting community-based rehabilitation programs. 2. Training and accountability. Provide implicit bias training for law enforcement officers and implement mechanisms for holding officers accountable for discriminatory practices. Encourage transparency and accountability within police departments. 3. Investment in communities. Redirect resources from punitive measures to community development initiatives, such as education, healthcare, and affordable housing, to address the root causes of crime and reduce the reliance on incarceration. 4. Legal representation. Ensure access to quality legal representation for all individuals, regardless of their socioeconomic status, to prevent wrongful convictions and ensure fair trials. 5. Community policing. Implement community policing strategies that foster positive relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve, emphasizing collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. 6. Reentry support. Provide comprehensive reentry support services for individuals leaving incarceration, including access to housing, employment, education, and mental health services to facilitate successful reintegration into society. 7. Advocacy and policy change. Advocate for legislative and policy changes at the local, state, and federal levels to address systemic racism within the criminal justice system and promote racial equity and justice for all. Addressing systemic racism within the criminal justice system is a complex and ongoing process that requires collaboration, dedication, and a commitment to justice. By implementing these strategies and continuing to engage in dialogue and advocacy, we can work towards a more equitable and just society for all individuals.
Your proposed strategies for addressing systemic racism in the criminal justice system are well considered and comprehensive. They address various aspects of the problem, from policy reforms to community engagement and long-term support. It's important to acknowledge that there is no single solution, and a multifaceted approach like the one you outlined is crucial for achieving lasting change. Enacting policy changes, fostering community relationships, and providing support for reintegration are all essential steps towards dismantling systemic racism and building a fairer justice system. It's also crucial to recognize the importance of ongoing dialogue and community involvement. By raising awareness, engaging in critical discussions, and actively advocating for reform, we can create the momentum and support necessary for long-term systemic change. Would you like to explore the potential challenges and obstacles in implementing these strategies, or perhaps delve into specific examples of successful reform initiatives in different communities?
Absolutely. Ongoing dialogue and community involvement are indeed crucial components of any effort to address systemic racism in the criminal justice system. In addition to the strategies outlined earlier, it's essential to consider the potential challenges and obstacles that may arise during implementation. 1. Resistance to change. There may be resistance from various stakeholders, including law enforcement agencies, politicians, and members of the public, who may be resistant to reforms that challenge the status quo or their own biases. 2. Resource constraints. Implementing comprehensive reforms requires significant resources, including funding, personnel, and infrastructure. Limited resources may hinder the ability to fully realize reform initiatives, particularly in cash-strapped communities. 3. Political opposition. Political interests and ideological differences may pose challenges to enacting legislative and policy changes at the local, state, and federal levels. Overcoming political opposition may require strategic advocacy and coalition-building efforts. 4. Legal and institutional barriers. Existing legal frameworks and institutional structures may pose barriers to reform efforts, particularly if they are entrenched in systemic racism or bias. Overcoming these barriers may require legal challenges and strategic litigation. 5. Community resistance. In some communities, there may be resistance to reform efforts, particularly if they perceive changes as threatening to their interests or way of life. Building trust and engaging with community members is essential for garnering support for reform initiatives. Despite these challenges, there are examples of successful reform initiatives and promising practices that have been implemented in various communities across the country. For example, 1. Bail reform. Several jurisdictions have implemented bail reform measures to address the inequities of cash bail systems, which disproportionately impact low-income individuals and communities of color. 2. Diversion programs. Diversion programs, such as drug courts and restorative justice initiatives, offer alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenders, focusing on rehabilitation and community-based interventions rather than punishment. 3. Police accountability measures. Some communities have implemented police accountability measures, such as civilian oversight boards, body cameras, and implicit bias training to promote transparency, accountability, and trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. 4. Community-led initiatives. Grassroots organizations and community-led initiatives play a critical role in advocating for reform and driving change from the ground up. These initiatives focus on empowering affected communities, amplifying their voices, and advocating for policies that address their needs and concerns. By learning from these examples and engaging in ongoing dialogue and collaboration, absolutely, ongoing dialogue